Hello everyone and welcome to this revision video on how did different people experience the British Empire. In this video we're going to focus on our inquiry and some key information about the British Empire and how people experience the empire. Let's look at the big picture to start off with. These maps show you how the British Empire changed at different times in its history. So you can see the British Empire started off quite gradually in the 17th century. You can see there, but by 1765, the British had control of the so-called 13 colonies, which obviously got their independence from 1776. They declared their independence, and after a war, that went on to form the United States of America. And then the British Empire grew massively in the 19th century. We can see there, for example, particularly in Africa during the scramble for Africa, but also completed its colonization of India during this time, as well as Australia, which are the two countries, India and Australia, those really honed in on in this inquiry. It used to be said that the sun never set within the British Empire, and that gives us a little bit of a clue about how large the empire was. Now, in the 20th century, the British Empire began to reduce in size in a process called decolonization. The British Empire played an important, significant role in the First World War and the Second World War. Historian David Olusoga has written about the Forgotten Soldiers of Empire. It's a really great book and really talks about the importance of the empire to the First and Second World War. After the Second World War, the British Empire broke up as Britain wasn't as powerful, but also countries fought for and gained their independence. For example, India became independent in 1947 and was partitioned into India and Pakistan. And other countries followed, such as the Gold Coast became the newly independent country of Ghana. Jamaica became independent in 1962. Now, there are still some places in the world controlled by Britain today, most famously Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, and the British Virgin Islands, amongst others. The big story of the British Empire, the early empire in the 17th century, some important developments were the creation of the East India Company in 1600, just towards the end of the rule of Queen Elizabeth I. The very first British colony, or successful colony, was at Jamestown in 1607, and the empire developed slowly in the 17th century, gaining places like Jamaica and Barbados, which were obviously heavily connected to the transatlantic slave trade. In the 18th century, there was again resistance against British rule, like Nanny Maroon in Jamaica, for example. And the key event was in 1776. Britain's 13 colonies declared independence, leading to the formation of the United States of America. Other important developments: the East India Company increased its control over India, particularly after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. And James Cook's voyage to Australia heralded the beginning of its colonization as well. Now, in the 19th century, this is very much the peak of the British Empire. The British Empire expanded greatly, took control of places like India, Australia, Canada, and many countries in Africa, such as Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, which was known as Rhodesia at the time. And then, obviously, we saw that process of decolonization in the 20th century, in the sort of second half of the 20th century. Okay, so we're going to start off just by looking at the experience of India within the British Empire. So if we have a look at India, the first thing to really stress with India is that India was colonized by a British company, not the British government. And that company was, of course, the East India Company. Now, from 1600, the East India Company began to develop trade links in parts of India, such as Bengal, which you can see in dark green on the map there. Now, India at the time was ruled over by the powerful Mughal Empire, and at first the relationship was one of trade. The Mughal Empire was very powerful and very wealthy with many riches, gives us the modern English word of Mughal. But by the 1750s, the East India Company was becoming ever more powerful within India. It was ignoring local laws and using force to make unfair trade deals with local people. So that led to a local ruler, which in India is known as a Nawab, a local ruler in Bengal called Siraj ud Dowlah, attacking an East India Company fort called Fort William in June 1756. British soldiers were taken captive and imprisoned in a small cell in an event which has been remembered as the Black Hole of Calcutta, and which actually was exaggerated quite heavily for propaganda reasons by the British as well. So you can see there some of the different trading bases set up around India in the 17th century. Now, in retaliation for the events of the taking of Fort William and the Black Hole of Calcutta. An East India Company general called Robert Clive and his forces retook the fort and defeated the forces of Suraj ud-Dowlah at the Battle of Plassey. They had been heavily outnumbered, but Robert Clive used a mixture of luck and skill and bribery in order to win this battle. Now, this was a huge turning point in British rule in India. The East India Company began to take more direct control of parts of India, and much wealth was looted from India. We talked about how loot was an Indian word in origin. Robert Clive himself took £2.5 million, which is around about 400 million in today's money. The East India Company began to charge taxes and they neglected to prepare for famines. They simply did not see that as their role. They were simply a profit-making company, basically designed and set up to extract lots of wealth and resources from India. Now, the East India Company exacerbated the effects of the Bengal famine of 1770, which saw around about between 7 and 10 million people die. The East India Company carried on collecting all of its taxes throughout this famine. So the Battle of Plassey was a key turning point in the control of the East India Company over India, and it reflects how violence and quite often racism actually was a key aspect of empire. Even back home in Britain, Robert Clive didn't have a particularly great reputation. A play was made which characterised him as being Lord Vulture. After the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company increased its control as well in southern India. Now, the Tipu Sultan, who is known as the Tiger of Mysore, resisted East India Company control in Mysore. And you can just see the orange shade of that map there is where the Mysore Kingdom was. So the Tipu Sultan had been a bit of a hero in fighting back. He defeated the East India Company in a battle in 1784. But in 1799, the Tipu Sultan's forces were finally defeated. The East India Company looted his palace, taking artifacts and riches back to Britain, including one of the key artifacts that we studied, the automaton organ, which shows the Tiger of Mysore, which represents the Tipu Sultan, attacking a European man, perhaps an East India Company man. Now, when the organ plays, it sounds a roaring tiger and a screaming man. Now, in terms of this artifact focus, what can this tell us? This artifact, it can tell us, and it can be used by historians to explore attitudes within southern India towards Europeans and the East India Company. The very fact that it was looted tells us of how the East India Company took wealth and resources out of India. And today it can be found in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which tells us that many of these things that were taken out of India during the British Empire have never been returned. Okay, so we're into the 19th century. How did people in India experience the British Empire? Christian missionaries were sent out to convert local Hindu and Muslim Indians to Christianity. The Cornwallis Code of 1793 led to high rents and taxes for local Indian people. In 1849, the East India Company also took possession of the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is a priceless diamond. It was eventually given to Queen Victoria and is now part of the crown jewels. Now, in terms of this artifact focus, we can see the Koh-i-Noor diamond right in the center of this crown, which is part of the crown jewels. Now, the Koh-i-Noor diamond was a priceless artifact associated with Mughal India. It was taken in 1849 after the British forced a Punjab 10-year-old boy ruler called Dalip Singh, who's pictured there, to hand it over, and it eventually became part of the crown jewels, as we have said. And so today, obviously, that is still within Britain. Okay, now Indian people began to want to resist British rule, and the key aspect of this was the Indian Rebellion, sometimes known at the time as the Indian Mutiny, and sometimes referred to in India as the First War of Indian Independence. Now, in 1857, a decision to use a grease on the cartridges of guns made from beef and pork fat led to anger amongst the sepoys, and this is because Muslims do not eat pork, and also for Hindus, the cow is a sacred animal. So this sparked a lack of cultural understanding from the British, which showed a lack of cultural understanding. 85 sepoys were jailed for refusing to use the guns, and that sparked the Indian Rebellion. It lasted for 18 months and was across the whole of northern India. Now, afterwards, the British were ruthless in their punishments of what they regarded as rebels. Some of them were even indeed fired out of cannons. The British also took direct control of India, which was now ruled by a viceroy. And although they began to interfere less in things like education and religion, the British continued to take wealth and resources out of India in a period of rule which is known as the British Raj. This is when the British took direct control of India, and this rule lasted for around about 90 years. And the East India Company was abolished and disbanded by an Act of Parliament. So a key point here, the Indian Rebellion shows the lack of cultural understanding, but also the scale of opposition towards British rule. It's a turning point which led to the British taking direct control and the era of the British Raj. So the period of British rule in the 19th century was known as the British Raj. India was often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Queen Victoria herself was given the title Empress of India. Now, wealth continues to be taken out of India. Although 28,000 miles of railroads were built, these were actually made to benefit British trading and help soldiers to be moved about more easily to crush any rebellions. It's estimated 25 million people died due to British rule in India, and historians like William Dalrymple have shown that India's share of world trade declined significantly due to the impact of empire. In fact, William Dalrymple says that when the East India Company was founded in 1600, Britain was generating 1.8% of the world's economy, their gross domestic product, GDP, while India was producing 22.5%. But by the peak of the Raj, those figures have basically been reversed. India's thriving textile industry, for example, had been broken up, and most of that textile industry had been taken and was now, many of the world's textiles, cotton industry was now based in northwest England, in a place like Manchester, which was known as Cottonopolis during this time. Okay, so how did people in Australia experience the British Empire? Well, first it's important to understand who was living in Australia before the British arrived. They were Indigenous Australians, sometimes referred to as Aboriginal peoples, and they were living on the land. They lived a largely nomadic lifestyle, which means they moved around from place to place. They cared for the local environment, using things like fire stick farming to look after the land. Now, at the time of first contact, there were 500 Indigenous Australian nations speaking around about 250 different languages. Now, Aboriginal people, Indigenous Australians, they lived as subsistence hunters, so they ate just enough of the plants and animals and fish to meet their needs. They believed that rivers, plants and animals had spirits and that people could not own land. Now, there is a myth that Australia had no or very few people living there before the arrival of James Cook, but obviously this is quite untrue. The culture and ways of life of Indigenous Australians were flourishing. So in 1770, a group of scientists and botanists and astronomers and navigators set off to discover Australia. On the 29th of April 1770, James Cook and his men. James Cook was a Royal Navy commander. He grew up in North Yorkshire, so he has a local link. Born in a place called Marton, which is just outside Middlesbrough. Anyway, he landed at Botany Bay in eastern Australia, had a violent encounter with the indigenous Guigal people, one of whom may have dropped a bark shield. And the bark shield is another artifact which reveals that the first encounters were violent. James Cook declared the entire east coast of Australia as a British colony and persuaded later on the British government to colonise the lands which were regarded by Cook and others as a terra nullius, which means land of nobody. Now, Cook himself was killed in Hawaii by indigenous peoples in 1779. Now, in terms of the artefact focus here, the bark shield, the first meeting between the British and the indigenous Australians was characterised by violence. The bark shield in the British Museum is one of the same type that would have been dropped during this first encounter and brought back to Britain. The bark shield was taken back to Britain and it resides within the British Museum today. So the actual colonisation of Australia really began in 1787-1788. So in May 1787, 11 ships left Portsmouth for Australia, and they were known as the First Fleet, and they arrived in Australia on the 26th of January 1788, a day which is now remembered in Australia as Australia Day. On board were also 736 convicts. Britain was using Australia as a prison colony, and the punishment was known as transportation, and it lasted until 1868. And people would get sentenced to maybe 7 or 14 years or life of hard labour in Australia. And many of these convicts were used to actually create and build the colony, so they could be doing all sorts of work, from farming to digging ditches to clearing forests to building fences. During the 19th century, however, more and more British and European people came to live in Australia. At first, many of them had been convicts, but more and more free settlers also came to start new lives, particularly from the 1820s. A gold rush in the 1850s sparked even more to settle in Australia. Now, the empire in Australia was quite different to India, as more British people settled in Australia and took control of lands from the Indigenous Australians, and that led to Indigenous Australians being excluded from society. Now, there was conflict between the British and the Indigenous Australians throughout this time period. They were known as the Frontier Wars. Massacres of Indigenous Australians took place, such as the Myall Creek Massacre in 1838, where white settler colonists murdered 28 Indigenous men, women and children. There were other examples of atrocities, such as poisoning Indigenous peoples by putting poison in flour. By the middle of the 19th century, the British gave the colonists the right to self-govern. Australia became a democracy, but the rights of Indigenous Australians were restricted. Many were made to live in enclosed areas that were fenced, called reserves. Their ways of life were destroyed by colonisation. Laws restricting the rights of Indigenous Australians continued into the 20th century, even after Australia had become independent of the British Empire. So the key point here is that Indigenous Australians had their rights restricted way into the 20th century, and helps understand that the legacy of empire for Indigenous Australians was long-lasting, and to some extent is still very much discriminated against within Australia today. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is how did people in Africa experience the British Empire. So although Britain got rid of the slave trade in 1807, by 1900 Britain was exploiting Africa through colonisation. In total, Britain had 16 colonies in Africa. European nations had met in Berlin in 1884-85 to carve up Africa in the so-called Scramble for Africa, and that map there shows you all the different places within Africa and the different countries within Africa that were controlled by European countries such as France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and of course Britain. Now, these are a list of some of the different countries that Britain had control of in the late 19th and early 20th century within Africa. And then just looking at the experience of people in Africa of the British Empire, where we looked at a few case studies. So the British fought against the Zulu peoples during the Anglo-Zulu War, which gave them further control of South Africa. This was despite the British being defeated at the Battle of Isandlwana. Instead, they focused on victory at Rorke's Drift. This led to Zululand being incorporated as part of the British colony of South Africa. In Benin, the British looted and destroyed Benin City and took control of Benin and added it to the colony of Nigeria. The Benin bronzes were looted and taken back to Britain in 1897, and they're still in the British Museum, with many regarding that the Benin bronzes should be returned to Nigeria. The Benin bronzes are, of course, important sculptures depicting the Obas, the rulers of Benin, and the artifacts still reside today in the British Museum. And then finally, the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes tricked King Lobengula in signing away the Ndebele kingdom, and these lands were included in his colony of Rhodesia, which nowadays is known as Zimbabwe. Thanks very much for listening to that revision video about how different people experienced the British Empire. Goodbye.